I hope we are pretty clear of how we are using a Hegelian master-slave dialectic to understand a abstract, admittedly abstract colonial situation in the first instance. And our conceptual question is that if the slave is the one who can twist free from the master-slave dialectic or that particular confrontation, then the implication would be colonialism, if it can ever be dismantled, overcome, whatever that means. We don't even know what that means yet. Then this is not going to come from those who hold the power, not those who are satisfying their desires. So any kind of sort of dominant ideological attempt to be just is not to dismantle the structure, it is making the structure to function more efficiently, more effectively, more subtly. So then if from a Hegelian perspective, an overcoming of postcoloniality is possible, then it also needs to be always the negation of the colonial structure. Now, with Derrida, we are going to see the implications of that. If you are overcoming something by negating it, then you are caught up in it in a way it is much more insidious and complicated, but you are caught up in it. Overturning, negation are far from being radical changes. They are actually fairly conservative ways of being caught up in that which you are trying to negate. Now, for our purposes, it's even more complicated once we do this from this perspective of identity. If you are seeing post-coloniality, you shouldn't, but if you do, as the negation of a certain identity, and we do that because this is an ideological foil, if you can overcome white, male, European, Christian perspective, if you negate them, you are somehow going to be freed from the structures that those identities created. That is the mistake. It's not just a mistake, it's an ideological hoodwink, I think. Like, if you negate that identity, you are actually being implicated in that identity in a way that is much more dangerous to twist free from the structure. So I want to move away from understanding is from the perspective of identity, not in order to excuse any kind of identity, but by being the opposite of white European male identity, we might end up being exactly the same structure of that created that identity. That's my conceptual problem. That's my conceptual issue. If you believe that by playing this only in terms of identity, then you can overcome that structure. History shows us that it has not been the case. Put it a little bit crudely, what happened is that a lot of different groups ended up taking the structural position of white, male, Christian colonizer. Now, that we can play that game. That's, to me, Obama's game, perfect union. If we can put everybody at the center, those are American, we can just sort of continue to prosper and dominate nature or dominate the world. Or we can start to think structurally, not at the expense of identity, but understanding identity as a function and the product of this structure rather than, and by structure, I don't mean in a structuralist sense, like unchanging structure or something like that, but historical, economic, political patterns of reproducing inequality. By making yourself equal, you are not undermining the structures that produce inequality. You are just putting yourself into the more advantageous situation. And unfortunately, in Western universities, I think this is what is being taught to human beings, as you also can be the colonizer. You can also exploit the world. You can also be, or otherwise, you can also save the world. Like, you can also go around the world and save the world as well. which is exactly the same understanding of your position with respect to the structure. Now, if you ask me like, then what? Then we need to start understanding the production of these patterns of inequality. Why do they happen? And I think we get our first clue from Hegelian object of desire, but that's not all there is to that, but that notion of economic advantage. It doesn't matter whether I am, as a Turk, accepted in a Western university and given certain position of privilege. I cannot, on the basis of that, claim that the structural inequality against third world is somehow overcome. That's narcissistic, that is delusional, that is politically dangerous. I might have said myself, and I can start acting like a Western European subject as well within these structures of power, but that doesn't, in my person, I'm not achieving any form of justice or anything like that. Now, there are lots of people who recognize this. I'm not obviously saying anything radical, new, etc. But I was just teaching the Earlham seminar the first half of the second semester. And Michelle Alexander talks about this in the New Jim Crow in terms of trickle down racial justice, in the sense that if we can give justice to some privileged people at the top, that's somehow going to trickle down to people. That is as problematic as any economic theory of trickle down. If we give a lot of money to, I don't know, Jeff Bezos, that somehow we are all going to benefit from that, which clearly is not happening. So that's the problematic. Now, with Derrida now, we are trying to understand this, what he calls the colonizing principle. Are we good? So I'm not doing stick figures, Daniel, so I'm erasing myself from this meeting. We don't need stick figures. Let's just continue with concepts. Okay. Now, I hope you finished reading Derrida. Now, tell me your specific difficulties in reading Derrida. It's a speech, so it should be a little bit easier to follow. Yes, Esther.
I was actually wondering if you could give us a little bit of context for, so did he give a speech at the seminar? I forget the name of it.
So this is a conference in 1979, I think. It says in the first footnote, I believe, the crisis in teaching and philosophy. The context is a conference that is called, he mentions that at the beginning of the section of the speech, philosophy and the development of the sciences in Africa. And I think it is 1979, if I'm not mistaken, but I need to be, yeah. Translators notes. I thought so. I thought it was 1979, but I wrote it somewhere. I can find it like in sort of. So he's giving a speech talking about the sort of status of the sciences in Africa, and then of course sciences. There's always this awareness that he is a French intellectual, even though he is born in Algeria. Therefore, he plays out on this ambiguity, saying that I've never known whether I'm a colonizer and the colonized. And it's like, yes, you are a colonizer, so you don't have to like, yeah, don't have to worry about that too much. But I mean, he asked that question at least to himself, and he's giving a speech. I mean, Africa is like 95% of a continent that is colonized by France as England. So I actually have I put that on Facebook recently. I have a page on Facebook called Postcolonial Theory of Philosophy. So if you are still obsolete enough to use Facebook, you can go and find that on Facebook. So Africa was like completely colonized. So like you are a French intellectual coming and talking about philosophy in Africa. I mean, to his credit, Derrida is at least aware of the implications of this in terms of conceptual as well as historical problems. So I'm going to teach you philosophy now, and I'm going to teach you like how sciences, which Europe always takes credit for the development of the sciences, that have always been sort of historically appropriated to Europe. I mean, even today, if you look into your science curriculum, it's 99.9%, if not more, is like scientific Western discourse, right? That's like, and then there's not even a sort of, let alone apology, not even a kind of awareness of this. Like, of course, this is truth. This is universal truth. It doesn't need to be relativized in any sense. It doesn't need to be historicized in any real sense. This is factual truth. So he's very aware of this, and he's immediately problematizing these concepts. What do we mean by philosophy? What do we mean by teaching? What do we mean by sciences? What do we mean by Africa, which as a continent, given this sort of unity in its colonization? So that's the kind of, he tries to lay out all the problems of someone giving a speech and teaching to those people who are colonized by the French about the future of the sciences. So he lays that out pretty well, at least as a question. Of course, Derrida himself, he doesn't develop this very much. So, I mean, this is, I keep reading this text because I don't really find, maybe that's my laziness, I don't find texts that will address this particular question better than this. So that's really roughly the context. And then like, why should we be interested in how people teach philosophy in France? And, you know, should we accept this French model? Like, you know, sometimes it's, oh, in France, people teach philosophy in high school. Isn't that wonderful? We should all do that. We should do that in Africa, etc. And there's that kind of tension always, taking your models from the Western perspective. And he problematizes that. So he starts out with this recognition that I'm aware of what I'm doing, to the extent that it's possible, to the extent that you can master that awareness. I know I'm in a sort of precarious situation of pretending to teach something that has been for centuries the tools of colonization. Masha.
Could you also speak a little bit about deconstruction? So I know we touched on this notion in the film theory class, but it was a little unclear to me then. And he keeps bringing this word up, like on page, I think, 8 of this document. It's like the era of deconstruction,
Okay.
deconstructive shaking. So I just wanted to ask you to clarify a little bit what that means.
Sure. Like every sort of serious reader of deconstruction, I should be cautious about generalizing from like a theory. So deconstruction, according to Derrida and in his practice, is always a way of reading the text, a way of trying to understand how mastery is constructed. And he always starts with this recognition of a certain binary opposition. Binary opposition is two things opposing to each other, which pretty much pretends or purports to dominate the domain, the sort of have the entire domain in it, like good and evil, up and down, etc. That sort of, that opposition sets up the entire perspective. Like used to be, I think it still is to a certain extent, but more problematic, male, female, for example, that sort of dominates the sort of discourse on sexuality, etc. So Derrida's point is that in every binary opposition, there's always a hierarchy implied. There's always one term appears to be hierarchically inferior to the other. Well, of course, this works pretty well in colonizer and the colonized, but also it works in every single opposition. Some oppositions, of course, more ambiguous than others. I don't know, up and down, maybe it's one of the interesting oppositions that, I don't know, up is always privilege, I don't know. But light and dark, black and white, certainly in the world. So there's always this kind of hierarchization of the opposition. Now, Derrida's point is that it appears that the dominant term always constructs itself by excluding the less dominant or non-dominant term. So it always gives this impression that the dominant term can construct itself by excluding the other, and it does so. Now, Derrida's reading is that this is far from being that. In fact, for the constitution of this opposition and the hierarchy, the construction of the oppressed term or the non-privileged term is substantial. So the first stage of the construction is to reverse the opposition. It appears to be that the privileged term is more hierarchically superior, but in fact, in the construction, the underprivileged term is more elemental, more important. So when you say, for example, Europe constructs itself by talking to itself, etc., in fact, you identify that the creation, the postulation, the imagination of non-European is much more significant in the constitution of European identity. So Europe pretends to create an identity on its own, by itself, in a kind of non-Hegelian, non-dialectical way. It sort of tries to articulate that, you know, we created ourselves out of nothing. We are self-sufficient subjects, self-standing. One day we got up and wanted to conquer the world, and we discovered science and weapons, and we dominated the entire world. In fact, when you analyze the discourse, you see that that European identity is always constructed in opposition to a non-European, African, Asian, other identity, and both conceptually, but also materially significant in construction of that identity. But then the second stage of the construction is that this opposition itself is not sustainable. This is not privileging one term over the other or reversing the privilege, which might appear like a Hegelian master-slave opposition and the overturning of that opposition. The construction takes the second step that this very construction of opposition itself is problematic and conceptually unsustainable. Hence, there is really conceptually no distinction, real distinction between European and non-European. That very opposition is imagined. That very opposition is constructed. Thereby, since you are constructed as the other of Europe, you should not take this seriously as your identity, because your underprivileged identity is actually created by the privileged term. So there are at least two sort of phases in which overturning or the opposition and deconstructing the opposition, not just overturning, but dismantling it so that the opposition itself does not continue. That's the best I can do so far in terms of how to characterize deconstruction, as opposed to nowadays everybody uses deconstruction as any kind of taking something apart. Well, that's not deconstruction. That's just a metaphorical and mostly wrong way of using, like, you know, I'm going to deconstruct this book now. It's like, you are just reading it. So this is not like a kind of meaningful use of the term deconstruction. Okay, Nolia, I'm stopping now. So.
I'm wondering, the note that this speech ended on confused me a little bit. Like he says, like his goal is not a report on the state of philosophy or the teaching of philosophy, but rather a long preamble to the questions he wants to ask you, as well as the discussion which he hopes to take part, and a slow way of preparing to listen to you. So I felt a little bit left in the dark about what you meant, what the discussion was. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or things to add on to understanding that.
Well, obviously, he comes from France, from Europe, and he is speaking in Africa. Of course, one of the dangers is that is putting into this privileged position of lecturing scholars from Africa. So of course, as a reasonable person, he says, my aim is not to lecture you, but to try to listen to you, try to understand what you are saying. So he is putting himself into this position of listener rather than like a teacher who is teaching, because that's the kind of colonizing principle, right? So Derrida comes to Africa and then teaches these poor Africans what it means to be a philosopher and scientific development, etc. He's completely overturning that, and he's saying like, I'm listening to you. I think that's his gesture. It's a like long way of shutting up for Derrida. Yeah, Hannah.
I thought it was also meant to be kind of a nod towards the argument that he made earlier about how like the education system, in order to like decolonize it, you have to reshape it and make it more about conversation and discussion. So I thought maybe that was more of like a, like, I don't know, like the cherry on top at the end, like, this is what I said we need to do, so now like, let's do it.
Okay. I know that's a very good question. Of course, as a teacher, I'm having a little bit of problem about the conversation and the discussion aspect of it, not because I disagree with it, but it appears to be as an easy solution. It appears to be sort of like I can do that. It would actually make my life a lot easier if I would just shut up and we just talk to each other. Would that solve our colonizing principle?
Well, I don't think he wasn't, I don't know how to phrase this. Like when he was talking about like reshaping how philosophy should be taught or discussed or whatever, he was talking about needing to change it because it's being used to support disciplines that enforce like capitalism, those kinds of societies. So I don't think he's saying like it either has to be used for that or we just talk to each other and ask questions. I think he was kind of exaggerating a little bit his point so that there was a little bit more, I guess, urgency behind it. So like philosophy doesn't support its to guide discussion, kind of. So like it still needs to be taught, but the ultimate goal of it being taught is to guide discussion and to ask questions, I guess.
Oh, I mean, I wasn't saying this against you or anything. I mean, you are absolutely right. It's a complicated question for Derrida because he is going to try to understand what it means for the colonized, as a colonized, to speak. Can you even remain colonized if you are given that platform to speak? We are not going to read this, but for those of you who are interested in this question, you can look at Beatrice Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? That might be a good, some of you actually do it in some other reading groups that I know that are going on. So that's an interesting point of connection between Spivak and Derrida. Yes. Nolia?
No, I just forgot to lower my hand, that's all.
Oh. Okay, so I want to read a few passages. This kind of, it's a very interesting point that he makes that I was taken aback a little bit, of course, when I first read this, because there's always this appealing aspect of philosophy for me that we always ask what it is. So there's always a part of philosophical discourse is to raise the question of what philosophy is. And it's always the crisis in the fact that people are never receptive and engaging with philosophy. So ever since its inception with Socrates, philosophy always, even before Socrates, always has these questions like, oh, your head is up in the sky, you belong to a different world, you don't belong to this world, this is not a kind of practical discourse, etc. And there is always this crisis of understanding what philosophies attempt to understand what it is. And it's always a question, a philosophical question of what philosophy is. Now, Derrida interestingly sees that as a kind of imperialist tendency. The crisis of a crisis, there's that, even that kind of ostensible self-doubt understanding your limits, etc., is itself an imperialist project. Now, once you think about it that way, then it becomes very complicated of how do we get out, if possible at all, from this imperialist gesture, or do we lean into this imperialist gesture and try to understand its nature? Now, one of the things that he says, and I say that as a kind of privilege of philosophy, to be able to speak to every single discipline. Now, for Derrida, that is problematic because then you are trying to, from a position of power and privilege, trying to delimit the boundaries of all the other disciplines. Now, of course, like if that is imperialist, then for me, it's not possible not to be imperialist because those disciplines do not define the limits of their own knowledge. And they become somewhat colonial or imperialist themselves. Like, for example, like you cannot just sort of say, oh, I'm just talking in terms of physics. That's my discipline. I am the absolute master of the entire discipline of physics, which means physics today say that modern physics explains nature in the most dominant and best possible way. Nothing else can explain it. And if there are different ways or alternative ways of understanding nature, that is either excluded from the domain of physics or explained by physics better than they can explain themselves. So this kind of philosophical nature actually exists in other disciplines too. For example, medicine, like Western medicine. Oh, we see the virtue of Eastern or non-Western medicine, but we can incorporate that by making certain chemicals that answer that question that is non-Western medicine does in a different way, etc. So that tendency always exists. So this teaching is always a question for Derrida. It's never a teacher kind of carrying an information to the students and imparting the boundaries of thinking, knowledge, etc. And you can perhaps be aware of this inescapable imperialist tendency that exists in teaching, while at the same time questioning it. And that's the only thing you can do, to be perfectly honest. So when I'm asking you to like, okay, don't believe what I say. Take what I say in order for you to be able to think whether you come to the same understanding through thinking. Don't take authority. Then don't take like, oh, he believes that or she believes that, they believe that, therefore I choose to believe it. That seems to be our model. Like, for example, we don't trust our own thinking. We just sort of say, if there's an authority who also thinks that way, I'm going to be more confident thinking that way. That's mostly political in order not to be isolated, not to be feeling like on your own, etc. So there's always that tendency. Now, philosophy is imperialist in a critical fashion. Now, my conclusion from this at the beginning of the class, I said, yes, philosophy is the fundamental foundation of Western colonialism. But unless we question the extent, the reach of Western colonialism at its fundamental level, we are never going to have any meaningful transformation in that, let alone understand. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Are there any questions? That is unclear. So if you want to kill the Western domination, you have to at least try to kill philosophy. Yes, Daniel. I mean, don't kill it because only philosophy can kill philosophy. So yeah, Daniel.
I mean, yeah, you said what I was going to say, so it's fine.
What?
You just said it, like you have to kill philosophy. That's what I was going to say, but you already said it.
Oh, you were going to say you were going to kill philosophy?
No, not me, but like in general, like if
You can do it, but only as a philosopher you can do it. You can't do it as an anthropologist. I'm sorry.
Different. But, but like I had a like similar though to that sentiment. I think at least in the text, like it seems to me that part of what like I guess Dario's trying to get at in that speech is like he doesn't really, I guess he doesn't really like say the claim explicitly or something, but I got the sense like he's almost, I got the sense like he's almost trying to gesture at another, like what other relations of philosophy can there be? Is
I
I
agree
think
with that. I agree with that. I mean, I'm trained in philosophy. I'm trained in a Western way of understanding the world in a way that is always in crisis. So, of course, you are looking for alternatives. You are not going to find a sort of entirely distinct discourse that's somehow going to protect you from all the pitfalls of colonialism. Yeah.
yeah, just so yeah, it's just like where like there is that's the thing that also really isn't like it seems like even if one was not to like kill philosophy, even like figuring out this possible new relation to it and then
Sure.
going and that somewhat still has to pass through and yeah it's like there's almost like a double bind going on with yeah.
That's absolutely true. Things become even more complicated because when I say philosophy, I really refer to a very small subsection of philosophy that is practiced in the world. Philosophy doesn't really have a unity that even Derrida attributes to it. There's a certain branches of philosophy today. In the United States, maybe 90% of philosophy is really caught up in this scientific discourse and completely colonial, completely dominating, completely trying to create discourses of mastery, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, sort of logic, sort of neurology, even, etc. So when I say philosophy, it's really complicated that we are talking about a very specific historical sensitivity rather than a sort of overarching discourse. So like if you take philosophy as a discipline, I really hate 99% of it. It's just useless. So philosophy always has this kind of ambiguous designation that it is a kind of historical, certain philosophical, not even people or the places, but a certain way of understanding knowledge. And that's important to make that distinction because I don't want to appear to be defending philosophy as such as a discipline. In fact, kill it, yes, absolutely. I mean, you can shut down all the philosophy departments in the United States except for like 5 or 10, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, no, yeah.
No, I was just gonna ask about that because like I've heard you say before, it doesn't seem like all philosophy is ready to kill philosophy.
Yes.
And so like given that problem, like is it possible? And I mean, I know that's like kind of a big question. I'm not expecting an answer, but like I think that even within like the area of philosophy that you're talking about, does every single person in that like participates in that area, like that takes a real like detachment of self-interest, I think, in order to like kill your own discipline. And but then also I think that like this other area of philosophy that you're talking about operates in a position of thinking that it's better than the rest of philosophy, maybe. I don't know. I don't really have a question at all. I'm just thinking about that complication.
Okay, let me explain that a little bit further. I know this sounds like a exclusively philosophical question, but it really isn't. This really applies to all the disciplines. In all the disciplines that you are participating, there is a much more traditional, orthodox, way of doing it in which you create power, privilege, control, position, and they dominate. This happens in psychology, in anthropology, in physics, etc. There's always that kind of orthodoxy in every discipline. Now, when I say this also exists in philosophy, I'm talking about the way in which philosophical discourse is deployed in the world, but especially in Anglo-American tradition, that creates privilege, power, positions of control. They, disciplined in that way. They think in a certain way. They raise certain questions, but they're also not critical of their own enterprise as a potentially imperialist discourse. That's really the sort of inevitable aspect of any orthodoxy. You are not really questioning your own boundaries, your own presuppositions, your own privileges, your own like given privileges. So, and as I say, a lot of departments, a lot of philosophy in the world, but especially in Anglo-American, is dominated by that. So, of course, they are not going to even think that philosophy can be imperialist because they think they are right. They think they found absolute universal truth. So of course, they are not going to have any problem with that. Now, there is in every discipline, of course, there is sort of this more marginal critical reflection on the power of your own discipline. Now, I still privilege philosophy, not in the sense that philosophy departments are superior to the other departments, but as a discourse, philosophy asks this question in the most fundamental way. And if you can question the most fundamental assumptions, your transformation or questioning or deconstruction of colonialism is going to be most radical. So the deeper you get into the roots of Western thinking, which is to me philosophy, the more if you uproot them, the more you question them, the more effective, radical your critique is going to be. I mean, it's easy to criticize politics. It's easy to criticize sociology. It's easy to criticize anthropology, psychology, etc. But it is more difficult to question philosophy because it appears to be more fundamental, more obvious. Like, how can you question, like, these universal truths, etc.? Then you sort of have a historical analysis of that discourse, starting with the Greeks, and your questioning is more radical. So I always say to my students, like, I kind of find myself in this awkward position of defending philosophy as opposed to other disciplines. I defended the only reason that I got into philosophy is that this is where Western thinking is best preserved, best protected, best defended. Unless you somehow uproot those fundamental presuppositions, you are not changing anything about the world domination. So for me, it was always a negative tendency. Like, you need to get to the heart of Western civilization, and the heart is like, you need to take the heart out, and that heart is philosophy. And we can justify this conceptually in the sense that that goes back to the most elemental presuppositions. Now, that's what Derrida is also saying, but there is that problem with philosophy. By constantly questioning itself, its own boundaries, its own limits, it reproduces itself. So in a sense, if you are not engaged in a radical critique of deconstruction, but mere questioning, mere analyzing, you are actually perpetuating imperialist nature of philosophy. And that's what we do too. Like, let's question Western presupposition, or like, let's question Western XYZ. When people say that, they are actually, unbeknownst to them or against their own intentions, strengthening what they are questioning because they are not engaged in a proper question. Not a radical question. And you say, oh, Western countries are like that. When you make a statement like that, and when you are wrong, you are actually making Western countries stronger because you missed the target, you did not understand the fundamental aspect of it. To me, any kind of critique, like, okay, anthropology does a critique of Western domination in the construction of colonialism. I give them credit for that, that's great. But anthropology itself is a discipline that is created in order to sustain Western superiority, among other things, by producing knowledge about other human beings, and in the name of objective knowledge, they present it, but that knowledge is always interested, that knowledge is always motivated. It is always not just used, but also produced by exercising power over people. There is no corresponding knowledge with respect to Western countries. It's a Western discourse. There are no sort of tribes from different parts of the world coming to the academia and studying the strange habits of academicians, which actually we should do that. How do they produce knowledge? How do they privilege certain way of existing? Now, that's one aspect of it. Now, he continues to say, like, there is this notion of Occidental philosophy. And I talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the class, but this is also a very ambiguous situation, because I understand that you don't want to call that philosophy is always Occidental. I understand the tendency in that, because obviously other people historically as well as conceptually thought about what appeared to be philosophical questions before Greeks, before Europeans, etc. Now, the reason that it is called philosophia is a purely linguistic ancient Greek coincidence that philo, the love, friendship, etc. of Sophia, of wisdom, is a Greek term. Now, of course, there is no justification that there should be a kind of straight line from ancient Greece to Western Europe. That's a completely sort of problematic assumption. But since philosophy is the foundation of all the imperialist tendencies of Western domination, there is a kind of political interest in saying, yes, yes, philosophy is Western. It doesn't happen in other cultures. It is particular to your culture to be so dominating and imperialist in the world in a way other cultures isn't. So it really depends whether you are thinking that there's a privilege in philosophy that you want to own it too from a different culture. Like, oh, I want to be doing philosophy too, because it's such a great thing, such a wonderful thing, I want to do it too. And there's always that tendency that I'm ambiguous about. For example, like when people say, we want to be included too. We want to be included in American society. Like, do you really? Do you endorse everything American society does so far? Is the problem just your exclusion? Or by including you, aren't you going to be also complicitous in the injustices that the society does? So inclusion and demand for inclusion is very complicated, because I don't want to be called philosophy, because philosophy sucks. But if I think that philosophy is great, then yeah, please include me too. So that's a very complicated conceptual political question. Now, when Derrida says Occidental philosophy, he is talking about that kind of set of problems. He is not assuming that philosophy is completely Western, but he is not assuming that it is also non-Western either, because either way is problematic. Do you understand that? The example is also like, sort of like, do you want to be integrated into a burning house? Like, is that what you want? If philosophy is responsible for the suffering of non-Western cultures, do you want to be responsible for that? Yes, Claudia.
But then I understand that part of like not being included, because like it excludes you from all the horrible things that may include that, in this case, like philosophy. But then how do we call then like alternative ideas or like knowledge that kind of work like philosophy? but shouldn't be called philosophy because of what it would imply. But also like I kind of think that also being included as like under the term, like I just cannot deal with the idea that it's like philosophy 1 and philosophy 2 kind of as like just because like philosophy is under one, like that's what I understood that you were kind of explaining, like
Under
it can,
one?
like philosophy is like only one philosophy. And like being included in philosophy will include, yes, like the all the ideas and knowledge that comes with it, but also like being part of that same philosophy, you're being implied of like all the horrible things that also come.
Well, I want to, yeah, okay. I think I understand what you're saying. I want to like keep the name as a kind of designation because, you know, like, right? Since the beginning of time or since the beginning of human beings try to make each other feel healthy.
Mhm.
But we don't call all of it medical. People always were interested in the ways in which other people lived. So it's not like for the first time in history, Europeans started to pay attention to other people, but there's anthropology. It's not like people didn't know nature or observe nature, etc., but that there's science. So we make distinctions, like not every kind of knowledge of the external world is science, because obviously before the age of the European dominant science, people looked around the world and tried to come to conclusions, right? They weren't just like, oh, for the first time science appeared. I think philosophy is like that too. Yes, people always think. It's not like it's a European thing to have European tendency to be able to think, right? Of course not. The question is, philosophia, why would you appropriate other ways of thinking under the name of love of wisdom, which appears to be a Western dominant discourse describing others in terms of yourself? Oh, you are also doing philosophy. That means what you are doing is reducible to what I'm doing. That's also problematic to me. That's why I don't want to present this as a solution. I want to present this as a problem. Because don't call them philosophy, because then you are colonizing them. Now, when you call them non-philosophy, you are also excluding them. That is also true. So I'm not saying do this or don't do that, but either way, it's problematic. Either way, it has questions associated with it. So mere inclusion, we always imagine inclusion is going to solve our problem. That's our political problem. The issue is like sometimes inclusion is actually colonization, appropriation, transformation. You know this when you come to Earlham and you are included, if you are included at Earlham, you really need to be appropriated. You need to give up certain tendencies of yourself. You need to fit in. You need to become something other than yourself in order to fit this. That's the problem. That's the problem of colonization. We can privilege everybody in a sort of, I mean, we can't do that, of course, but we can pretend that we have a discourse that with diversity, we can include everybody. But you know, we don't include everybody the way they are. We include them by transforming them, colonizing them, making them fit. So I don't want that with respect to philosophy either. Oh, there's a Chinese way of thinking. That's just philosophy. At least not as good. Oh, there is a different way of thinking. That's also we call philosophy. Let's call it philosophy because we dominate the discourse of philosophy. We know what it is, and I can regulate your thinking too. So that's why I always question this inclusion privileging that which you are included in. Like the United States is such a great country. All you have to be is to integrate the immigrants. Once we include the immigrants, it's going to be wonderful. It's like that also makes them, like, doesn't explain the fact that we can only include them in a certain way. by really erasing, undermining their authority and making them fit to us. That's why I'm ambiguous. I'm not saying include or not include. I'm not saying exclude, not exclude. Either way, there is a conceptual problem. That's why I don't want to call it just philosophy as if I'm doing you a favor. You are also philosophy. Don't worry. We'll call you what we call ourselves. Don't worry. We are generous.
So it's like, I think I kind of understand. Like, even, let's see, like what I got is like, even the action of me trying to call it something and trying to like identifying at like, oh, that's also philosophy, but it's just different. That also is problematic as it like, okay, I think I got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm starting to sweat because my identity is sort of put into question here as a philosopher. So I want, Masha, can you wait for like 9 minutes or so after the break?
My question was actually about the break.
9 minutes until 3:15. Okay. So Masha, you do not actually have a question, so I can move on. Okay. Just want to go to page 102 in the text that I gave you in Derrida. After talking about this paideia, which is education, Greek term for education, rearing, a kind of schole and universitas. Like here, he makes it sort of roundabout references to the idea that the entire Western philosophical educational system, Western educational system is based on this philosophical inception. So academia is academy is the term that used by Plato for the first school, and the lyceum is what lycée means in certain languages. High school is also the school for Aristotle. So, and these are not just sort of linguistic roots of Western tradition, but it is whatever we are doing today in terms of the organization of knowledge. Now, ironically, you know, for those of you who come from different countries, from different cultural backgrounds, you already see that you have schools. I went to a lycée. We have lycées coming from Aristotle. We have academy, universities. In other parts of the world, we wear those strange robes when we graduate, like everybody else. So there's a certain Western domination that is already at work. We cannot really deny that in ways that is not obvious, actually. I mean, we don't really think of it that way, but in my university at home, back at home, it's like purely Western tradition. We are trying to fit in. So that's, again, like you cannot deny that, you cannot be dismissive of that because you are partly being dismissive of yourself because you are already educated within that framework. So this is never really a question of like being Western or non-Western or like this is good, this is bad, this kind of opposition, but thinking of how patterns of power, structures of power are formed within this relationship. So when, therefore, he tries to make, quite maybe self-servingly, but interestingly, a parallel between decolonization and deconstruction. So he starts this discussion. I'm going to start with the page 102, the last paragraph, the last large paragraph. What even the terms, even the names like Africa is already speaking, even the act of naming speaks to a kind of exercise of power, organization, limitation, categorization. So most of the time in the United States, you know that obviously, maybe in other parts of the world too, but not as much. So they're like, this is like Africa, like don't even recognizing the kind of, I mean, I don't know to what extent that is necessary, but you don't know like different nation states within Africa, a lot of people. And then if you know them, sure, that's a good thing because you are a knowledgeable person, but you are also knowing what somewhat the result of colonial presence that African continent was turned into nations. So it's always a complicated relationship. So he says, like, even the Appel, I think that's the name, right? Africa is problematic. Yes.
Esau's in the waiting room, I believe.
I don't see anybody in the waiting room.
You don't see him.
It's here.
There you
We are recording that part, so you can go back and look at it. Is that what you're saying? Okay. So on page 102, go to the bottom, and I want to start with this idea of new relation to the philosophical, something that I was trying to explain, Claudia, that kind of new relation to the philosophical. It's like you're damned if you include, you're damned if you don't include, you're either way, it's problematic. These peoples, nations and states, these are not necessarily the same thing. Yes, thank you, Derrida. This is sort of a philosopher kind of saying us like, don't think that there is a certain like group of people just because you have a nationality. Like, you know, it's a certain amount of fiction, like the United States or France or Sudan, South Sudan now, etc. That this is all like a fictionalized understanding. And this non-coincidence, as you know, poses formidable problems because nationality in the international scene defines identity in most significant and politically, economically significant ways. Must define this relation after movements of diverse types of decolonization, even in the very process of decolonization that is underway. Of course, he's a little bit talking about like what happened after the Second World War in Africa in terms of the independence. What would follow here if the concept of decolonization, above all colonization, could have a radical meaning? And here he is really talking about radical meaning in terms of questioning the foundations of Western philosophical thinking at its foundation, at its inception. That this new relation to the philosophical, in order to be neither colonized nor neo-colonized, should not import either the self-repetition of Occidental philosophy. What is that self-repetition? It's constantly asking and producing a form of mastery. Or even its crisis. This is crisis, like crisis, we don't really pay attention to this term in a proper way. Crisis always having a issue of limit. Crisis, krinein in Greek, really means drawing boundaries. So crisis always trying to understand the boundaries, the limits of something. So when you are critical to something, you are not just saying this is good or this is bad. You say this goes as far as this, but doesn't go farther than that. That's a kind of delimitation. So critique, crisis, these are all activities that try to understand the limits of something. So even the crisis, or its models of crisis. How do you perpetuate this crisis? By saying like, you know, what is philosophy? When you ask that question, you are already asking presupposing that philosophy can be something. And that's a model of asking a question. Maybe it is just a way of life, not something that you can even understand. So there are different models according to which you can ask this question. Not even its values of property and reappropriation, which have sometimes imposed their strategic necessity on liberation and decolonization of movement. So here he is in a roundabout of saying is that in order to resist decolonize from European identity, we created different forms of identities, or colonized nation create different forms of identities, but those models of identities are also Western in their nature. And the fundamental example again is nation. The most decolonial or anti-colonial struggles have been in the name of nation state. Independence articulated in terms of national identity. Yet national identity doesn't always liberate. In fact, it doesn't decolonize. It actually makes you complicit within a Western project in ways that you cannot even anticipate. So in every nation state, even in the process of decolonization, there is always the exclusion of certain people within that national identity. And you can, in order not to offend anybody, I give this example in terms of Turkish identity during the independence war, in terms of exclusion of the Kurds and the Armenians, etc. This is like how we create identity at the expense of creating the other of the Turkish identity. So and I'm sure this happens in the same way in India with respect to Pakistan and in other African nations, where you create a national identity on the basis of some commonality that violently excludes somebody else. So the very idea of importation, or the opposed motive of non-importation, that's really significant. The opposed motive of non-importation, namely this constant desire to be non-European, is defining your identity in terms of simply as non-European, which in a sense glorifies or solidifies a kind of European identity in its very negation, pretending as if there is something like that you can negate, as if there is such a thing that I need to resist. And in my very resistance, I am actually constructing what I object, which didn't even exist pre that objection. Does that make sense? This is a very complicated sounding, but actually is not. Like, if you are not trying to be something, you are actually creating the identity of that which you are not trying to be, and that gives the impression as if it exists. So this is the kind of paradox of, I don't know, like some discourses like feminism or discourse on heterosexuality, etc. This sort of notion that you are creating an identity in the very opposite that you are trying to negate. Yes, Daniel.
So this is sort of like it's like, because like if you're defining self sort of like always against this thing, it's sort of, so what you're saying, I think what Derrida also is saying, is that you sort of end up reifying the thing you're opposing, like sort of almost make it stronger in a sense, or solidify.
I don't know if you are making it stronger, but you are
like you're taking something that actually isn't really there, and then like opposing it as if it's really there. But then in that process of opposing it as though it's really there, it sort of solidifies in like being there. Am I describing it correctly? So
solidifies is a better term, yes.
Okay, and so you want to, is it you, or like
come closer to the
mic? Yeah, what like seems like, yeah, what Derrida seems to be getting is, I guess, like, you want to, how do you oppose something that isn't, that act like in actuality is not like a solidified thing? Like, how does one do that? Is that seems to be the question he's opening up. And am I getting that correctly?
No, you are getting that absolutely correctly. I think one way of formulating that, maybe if it helps at all, is within a Hegelian perspective that he seems to be both operating and criticizing. The difference is always understood as an opposition. Difference is always understood as a negation. So if you set up the formation of identity in terms of this Hegelian perspective, the other's identity is always going to be opposed to mine. Now, the conceptual question after Hegel to think is, is it even possible or even desirable or even conceptually accessible to think a difference that is not oppositional? Can I formulate a difference without necessarily organizing it hierarchically? And that's very complicated because every kind of separation of into me and the other presupposes a kind of hierarchy, at least in the political social domain. Now we can think of it as in a very abstract way. We can say, of course, you and I are just different and we are not opposed to each other. It is not hierarchical. But if you think of it in its concrete, non-abstract determination, then there seems to be always a Western dominated power struggle, power structure. So conceptually, the question is it possible to think of difference and opposition without really falling into this trap of like, oh, if I can think of something conceptually, abstract conceptually, but not properly, then I can solve this problem. So I think this is some kind of an exercise in the sense that we always believe that not just our science, not just our knowledge, not just our technology, but our very way of being is superior to the others. And make no mistake, you all think that. You all think that at some way or another. You think that your way of being, your ideas, your opinions, your way of existing is superior to the others. Not because you are an evil person or anything like that, but that's the way in which we are organizing our lives conceptually for centuries. So maybe sometimes you think that you are superior to those who think that they are superior to you, which is a very understandable gesture, of course, because, you know, I mean, I do think that too. I somehow think that I'm superior to white supremacists because their supremacy is problematic, so I'm not as vile as they are. But there's always that implicit assumption about us living in the correct, superior way. Historically, this is the case. I'm sure like you believe in 2021, we are far superior to the other eras and ages. So that's a very important conceptual problem that we will struggle, but we'll start with Derrida in his next sentence that I will read. But before that, Claudia, Uyan, and Blessed.
I just wanted to like maybe like if this worked like an example, because like I felt kind of not attacked but identified when you said like you will always try to be like, you always think you're better or like superior, kind of like there's like that hierarchy. I just thought about it as like Puerto Ricans being a colony, like colonized, and like in a lot of ways being physically colonized as like economically, government wise, but also like the fear that a lot of people in Puerto Rico has that like without the US we're nothing kind of idea. As like how also like we have been colonized to think and to fear of being alone, and like even to fear being superior than the US. That's a lot, like that's why a lot of people want like statehood, because they believe that that's like their way to not, I feel, not be superior, because I feel we have been inherently taught to feel less in a lot of ways. But just like that need of like stability that people see in the US, and that like concrete colonization kind of way. But also I thought about like, for example, I want independence for the island, and then like how that idea of like superiority, like we're enough to be independent from the US, like we don't need you, that kind of feeling. So like that's what I wanted to share. Like I kind of felt very identified through that process, and like how it like becomes something very abstract as like just like the relation between these two nations, to a very concrete as to like even government, but also like how the people have become like have been socialized to think about certain like political identities,
Mm.
or like just their relation between like the US and Puerto Rico.
I think I understand. I mean, I feel the same way with respect to other kind of relationship between Europe and Turkey, for example. I think one thing that I would sort of pause a little bit, it is not just, it's importation and non-importation. I think that he finds both of them problematic. So those people who believing like, oh, Puerto Rico is just dependent on the United States or completely independent of the United States, I think it is the same model. Now, with respect to Hegelian setup, we have, of course, an issue because this never really happens in a sort of abstract space of pure neutrality. So there has been an economic structure that somehow made Puerto Rico structurally dependent of the United States. You cannot just have independence and forget that structure exists and sort of like, oh, we don't want anything from the United States. No, we actually want what the conditions under which that we came to this situation in the first place. It wasn't just like the confrontation of two equal cultures. Yes, we might still be economically dependent, but that dependence is not a justified dependence. It's a created dependence of oppression and exploitation rather than a kind of natural development of things. So that to me is the sort of problem, like, oh, the United States is rich, Puerto Rico is poor. It's like, yeah, the United States is rich precisely because a lot of other places are not rich and poor. And there is a certain historical context in this that you cannot just sort of ignore, right? So that identity formation, I always insist that it should never be considered as a purely subjective identity of personal construction, etc., but always in terms of the desire, the enjoyment, the economic, the sort of material aspect of it. You can never think of it purely in terms of like recognition. It's like, oh, we recognize Puerto Rican, we love them, they're just like us. It's like, no, that's really not that simple. I sort of like white people kind of extend their recognition to others in a very generous way. It's like, oh, we recognize you too, we love you too. I mean, sometimes at Urban they say some crap like that. Oh, we love, oh, great. Since you love me, I should be so like happy because you love me now or something. It's just like material conditions that are underlying this identity that is at work. So we cannot really, and then a lot of people make their decisions on the basis of that. So it is not really, that's not the way I was thinking about superiority, but superiority in the sense of, I don't want to be independent in the way that the United States is independent, because their independence is on the basis of making other people dependent. So the sort of the proceedings of post-colonial theory in terms of third world studies is a different way of thinking about economics, politics, identity, justice, and creation of sort of discourse. It's not purely just colonial in its logic, because, you know, Puerto Rico can go and colonize somewhere in the world and become rich too, I guess. I mean, it's very difficult now because it's all taken up, but that could also be possible, but that's not the way you think. And I think it's the same with respect to other places that are colonized by Europe. And Europe turns around and says, oh, you cannot govern yourself. Well, if I put you in the position that you put me, you couldn't govern yourself either. And I love this about like Africa. It's like, oh, there are no political institutions. Hell no, you destroyed all the political institutions. And then you turn around from this comparative politics perspective, say, oh, there are not enough like political institutions. It's like, okay, it's annoying to say the least, and conceptually problematic. as if these institutions grow on grass or something like that. Like they grow like independently of people's interactions and European occupation. Like, oh, poor Africa couldn't come up with institutions. Really? I mean, you have the audacity to say that. Well, you undermined all the institutions in that continent. Literally, not even like metaphorically, like physically, literally. And continue to do this economically. So I always want to not lose sight of that economic dimension so that we don't talk about this abstract recognition. Like you can, it's free, you can recognize anybody. It's free, unless you also recognize the material condition. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay, I'm going to read the next sentence, but Uyan first.
I just want a clarification. I don't know if you remember, but you talk about the question, conceptual question, can I even form identities without opposition or hierarchy? And I understand that, but then you moved on to like the following question, I think. Do you remember that?
I think the question was whether there would be a difference without opposition, maybe?
Differences without opposition? Yeah, I think something like that.
Yes.
Is that like, so did you answer that question? Is that possible?
No. No. Well, if I could answer that question, I would probably not be conceptually here, but like a very famous thinker who, I don't know, like lecturing in big stadiums or something. That's an impossible question. Like that's sort of Derridian. This is the question that I'm going to actually just step into now in terms of moving from 102, 103. So he says, the very idea of importation, just taking Western structures, or the opposed motive of non-importation, like we don't want anything Western, belong to the same logic. This is the same logic of binary opposition, right? Hence, and this is Derrida's question, the extraordinary theoretical, but not just theoretical, but also practical political difficulty. It's practical and political difficulty. How to do something more and other than overturn and thus reappropriate. How to do something more or other than overturn, just the opposite, and reappropriate, doing exactly the same thing. This more than critical difficulty, because this is a deconstructive difficulty, is common to the movements of both deconstruction and decolonization. So in other words, are you going as a colonial country, accept all the terms of Western domination of capitalism and identity formation? Or are you going to completely negate it, in which case you are caught up in the same logic because you are defined by what you oppose, because you are still limited. You are still constricted into what you don't allow yourself to do. And that's really the question of post-coloniality for Derrida. And I think conceptually, it, to me, expands to many other areas that we are interested in today, including critical race theory, women and sexuality studies, etc. So all the different domains in which that there is that conceptual question of doing something, not just the opposite. Now, ironically, when you have that opposite always is a kind of symmetrical negation of what you are opposing. So in a sense, like, you know, we observe this probably most readily today in the discourses of feminism, in the way that like you are, when you set up in the opposition between men and women as a kind of established opposition, as a binary opposition, etc., you are both negating but also the repeating of a certain white male discourse. That's the conceptual difficulty. So he says, for I believe in a word without demagogic facility and conventional deference toward my host, but rather as the source of uprooted African I am. He's not, but anyway. Born in Algiers, in an environment about which it would always be difficult to say whether it was colonizing or decolonizing. That between the effectiveness of the deconstructive era and the effectiveness of decolonization, historical connotation is necessary, irreducible, and thoroughly significant. Now, it's important, like, I don't, again, take this as Derrida's personal, like, oh, I'm so cool, etc. It's sort of more like a conceptual inscription into, I cannot identify myself as a colonizing or decolonized. And this is actually a very good question that we should always, as a way of life, ask to ourselves. Am I really the perpetrator of the thing that I'm criticizing? How am I situated with respect to what I pretend to be criticizing? Now, of course, in certain cases, this seems quite obvious. You don't really think like Walmart when he says Black Lives Matter, Walmart really thinks Black Lives Matter, right? Like, you don't believe that. That performance is not believable, I hope. Like, that's a gesture that you need to perform, right? Because you participate within an economic structure that makes you enormous amount of money. You're putting that sign there is really a kind of front for you to sort of play a certain game. But in certain other cases, that difficulty is much more complicated. So those who are actually, in terms of their identity, situated structurally in a certain way, but performing in a different way. And I think that's for Derrida always a question. He never sort of exonerates himself or completely blames itself, which ironically also how certain gestures like, oh, I'm so terrible. Yes, yes. We have exploited people for centuries. I'm so terrible. That very sort of facile discourse is actually perpetuating the very thing that because, oh, whatever I do, I'm going to be put into this position. No, there are lots of things you can do. You are just sort of feigning a kind of incompetence or impossibility of act you are refusing to act. But don't do that. But at least, like, stop exploiting people. That's the least you can do. But it's like, oh, wow, whatever I do, I'm going to be called this way. I mean, a certain like people do this in public. I understand the gesture because they express some psychological condition, whatever, but it's fake. It's fake because it's somehow performing a kind of opposite of what you are actually doing. So for Derrida, when he says, the African that I am, he is problematizing the very notion of the stability and the construction of the term Africa. Because I was born here, but I was Jewish. I mean, this is Derrida. I was Jewish, so I went to France. I speak French. I don't speak Arabic. So he has this kind of complicated web of relationships that everybody needs to negotiate. Does that make sense? I'm not telling you anything new. These are the things that you already know. Questions? I mean, I'm going to read one more sentence. If, like philosophy and the deconstruction of the philosophical, I like it. Like, is the deconstruction of the philosophical itself philosophical? In which case you have a problem. But anyway, if like philosophy and the deconstruction of the philosophy, decolonization is interminable. And I think that's a really important understanding. We look at this, oh, we are decolonized, it's over, colonization over. This is sort of like this complete chapter by chapter understanding of history, which is also the dominant Western discourse. Like, oh, the Middle Ages closed, we closed the door, we locked it, it's finished. Then progress, right? Wonderful, enlightenment, etc. Like this kind of categorization of history as saying like, oh, colonization, it's over, finished, it's in the past. Slavery, that was, they exaggerate and they say, that was 400 years ago, which it wasn't, but that's the discourse, right? It's like, no, you do not look at historical periods in terms of objects, like, or durations, like 3 hours, etc. Those are processes that transform themselves. And as you know, in the United States, even today, there are different forms of slavery, the remnants of slavery, the new Jim Crow, the old Jim Crow, new Jim Crow, they all exist in a continuous fashion. History is never some kind of a chapter by chapter understanding. So it's interminable. It is because it cannot be effective either as a simple mode of reappropriation or as a simple mode of opposition and overturning. In other words, when you overturn an oppressive structure in a paradoxical and interesting way, you need to look what are the things that continuing in that opposition. Did you simply change the actors of that opposition? Are you continuing with that very thing that you are trying to overturn? In fact, you are reinforcing it. That's the question. Therefore, you can never be decolonized because a lot of countries that are supposedly post-colonial are neo-colonial right now. Okay, I'm done. Hannah, and then.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is this that thing that Hegel was talking about where the slave is the only one that can overturn the master? It's never going to be able to undo a system, kind of.
And now Derrida is asking as to whether even slave can do that. Because for the slave, the only way to do that is by opposing to the master, being other than the master. Daniel.
Yeah. So is the issue really like, I don't know, I'm like the kind of overturning and that yeah, I mean he even uses like he uses simple like the word, and I'm just like thinking in terms of like Hegel, for example, like this sort of like mere overturning is not enough. Like just like mere, just like the simple overturning. But is there still like even within the Hegelian frame, like because Hegel does not, I feel like I think Hegel doesn't deal with simples necessarily. Like he moves from the simple to the, and so I'm just wondering if like yeah, like I guess the opposition, different than opposition, but still like can't there still be some kind of like a sublated overturning that is not a simple overturning? It's like some like it takes things from and then sort of like yeah. Does that make sense? Like can there be like overturning in terms of sublation and not like a simple mere like overturning? And will that, but does that still leave us in this oppositional trap? Or is it a different kind of opposition totally if that happens?
I can't really answer that question directly. I think that for Hegel, that, I mean, I don't even know whether for Hegel that is a good model. The master slave dialectic is a good model to understand decolonization. I mean, we just simply invented that as a kind of conceptual framework to work with. Now for Derrida, I think later in his thinking, he gives kind of indication of that. And I try to explain that a little bit. If we are thinking about the future by merely the overturning and changing and the negation of the past, Derrida believes that we are sort of confined into a colonial production of the future. So we are never going to get out of a kind of Western dominated, European dominated, science dominated, even if it is not perpetuated by actual Western people, it will still be that kind of way of thinking. Now, of course, to me, more and more post-colonial theory becomes tied into other discourses, like the way in which we live today, the way in which we reproduce our societies, the way in which we relate to our environment, the way in which we understand the globe and the nature, etc. So for Derrida, there is really this extrapolation of future, which is not determined in terms of the past. It's not just the negation of the past. The movement of time is not dialectical because, to be perfectly honest, I mean, as abstract as it might seem, if we continue with the Hegelian project, we are not, among other things, find any kind of, not solution, but even not a proper kind of response to global catastrophe, global crisis. We are not. We might postpone it, we might manage it, we might give science yet more power to manipulate it, but unless we think of a different, radically different future that is not determined by the negation of the past, then for Derrida, that's not even going to be decolonization. So therefore, I would say inclusion and sublation is not enough. It has to be something more radically different than that, because sublation and inclusion is within the colonizing logic. And we will see that more explicitly in 105, 106, more like 105 in Derrida. So we are going to ask that question, continue to ask that question. Okay, we have 3 minutes. Okay, I'm shutting this down.